All right, let's dive right in. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating friction, the collision between the massive, sweeping promises of the Indian Constitution and the very harsh mathematical reality of state resources. Instead of a boring textbook lecture, we're going to decode this by focusing heavily on key points and words to see how constitutional theory actually plays out in the real world. To give you a roadmap, we're zooming out step by step. We'll start with the purpose of constitutional rights, move into exploring fundamental rights, and then safeguarding those rights. After that, we'll hit directives and duties, look at public facilities as equalizers, and finally, face the budget allocation reality. Kicking things off with Section 1, the purpose of constitutional rights, looking specifically at Part 3 of the Constitution. Now, fundamental rights aren't just fancy legal jargon. They are basic, elementary entitlements. The key phrase to really focus on here is protecting individuals from a mere animal existence. Think about that. These rights exist to guarantee human dignity. It means, as a citizen, you're entitled to so much more than just basic survival or scraping by with minimal shelter. It's about ensuring your dignity remains absolutely intact. And what's wild is how the scope of these rights is constantly evolving. I mean, historically, citizens were literally fighting physical discrimination. We're talking cafes with signs that actually read, "Dogs and Indians not allowed." But contrast that with today. The challenges are vastly different. The Supreme Court recently expanded the right to life to actually include the right to mental health. Plus, we're navigating the right to privacy and data protection, especially with things like the new IT Bill 2025, which gives tax authorities the ability to monitor social media accounts. So, as society and technology evolve, the concept of rights evolves right alongside them. Moving on to Section 2, exploring fundamental rights. So, a question that comes up all the time. Are fundamental rights absolute? Well, the answer is a hard no. Your freedom is always regulated and limited. For example, no fundamental right sits above national security. Just recently, the Supreme Court made some oral observations regarding the use of Pegasus spyware. They were weighing individual privacy against the state's need to gather intelligence, so rights are constantly being balanced against the security of the state. Let's compare two really vital legal concepts by looking at the key words. Equality before the law means applying the exact same rules to every citizen equally. Basically, nobody is above the law. But equal protection of the law is a bit more nuanced. It actually means treating unequals unequally to ensure true equity, like creating special job reservations specifically for handicapped individuals. That isn't unfair discrimination, right? It's affirmative action designed to pull marginalized groups forward so they can actually participate equally. And that brings us to the right to freedom under Article 19. The key points you need to know here are freedom of speech, peaceful assembly, movement, and choosing your profession. This is huge because it empowers every single citizen. Whether you're an ordinary day laborer or a massive superstar like Rajinikanth, you literally have the exact same constitutional freedom to form associations or even enter politics. All right, let's jump to Section 3, safeguarding rights through remedies. Now, if you're ever accused of a crime, the Constitution steps in with specific safeguards to balance justice. You are presumed innocent until proven guilty by the state. There's no double jeopardy, which means they can't punish you for the exact same offense twice. There are no retroactive laws. You can only be judged by the laws that actually existed when the event happened. And crucially, you're protected against self-incrimination. But here is a fascinating distinction. While authorities cannot force you to testify against yourself, they can compel you to provide physical or biological samples, like a signature or a blood test. But what happens if the state oversteps? Well, citizens have these powerful tools called writs. The most famous one is habeas corpus. Literally translated, it means produce the body. And to understand why this is so vital, look at the harrowing Rajan murder case in Kerala during the emergency. Rajan, an engineering student, was taken by the police and just vanished. It was only after the emergency ended that his father filed a habeas corpus petition, which literally forced the authorities to admit they didn't have him and eventually expose that the young boy had been murdered in custody. This writ is quite literally a lifeline against illegal detention. Alongside habeas corpus, there are a few other essential writs to keep in mind. Mandamus is basically a command telling a public official to do their job. Prohibition stops a lower court from overreaching. For instance, the Supreme Court used this to halt the High Court in the case involving Italian Marine commandos and local fishermen pulling the jurisdiction up. Then there's certiorari, used to review a lower court's decision, and quo warranto, which literally asks an official, by what authority do you hold this office? Moving right along to Section 4, directives and citizen duties. There is a really vital contrast here between two big concepts. Fundamental rights are justiciable, meaning you can drag the government to court if they violate them. They put a hard limit on state power. On the flip side, you have the Directive Principles of State Policy, or DPSP. These are non-justiciable, so you can't sue the state for not immediately providing an adequate livelihood or equal pay. However, they act as very powerful moral guidelines to promote a welfare state. You hold the government accountable to these principles, just not in a courtroom, but at the ballot box. And sometimes these two concepts completely clash. The right to property is a massive example of this. It actually transitioned from being a fundamental right to a purely legal right. Why? Because the state needed to acquire land for development and welfare, so property rights had to be moved out of the fundamental category. Today, the government can absolutely acquire your land for a defined public purpose, but they have to follow the law and offer you compensation. Which brings us to Section 5, Public Facilities as Equalizers. Think about how we usually frame infrastructure. A public facility isn't just a hunk of concrete, it's actually a real-world facet of Article 21's right to life. The metro is a perfect example of social equality in action. When you step inside a metro car, a millionaire and a day laborer are sharing the exact same space. Your cash, your background, your language, literally none of it matters in that moment. Just compare that to traditional transit. Segmented railways are famously divided by AC classes, general compartments, ticket prices. Basically, if you have more money, you get better service. But the metro, it is one unified class. You cannot buy a better seat even if you wanted to. It's brilliant because it illustrates how government-designed infrastructure can practically, physically enforce constitutional equality every single day. And finally, we hit Section 6, the budget allocation reality. This is where we zoom out to the macro level. When we look at state expenses, a massive chunk of the budget, we're talking almost 24%, is completely swallowed up by non-negotiable interest payments on debt. Add in defense at nearly 10% and subsidies at over 8%, and you realize very quickly that a huge portion of the state's money is already spoken for before we even start talking about broad social development. And that leads to a pretty harsh reality for development. Just look at these shockingly low allocations. Education gets roughly 2.5%. Health sits at under 2%, and scientific departments, they receive less than 1% of the GDP. So if we ever wonder why we aren't producing more cutting-edge technology or funding deep research, well, this mathematical reality is exactly why. And these budget limits have severe, real-world consequences for citizens. Urban development gets a measly 1.7%. What does that actually mean for you? It means flooded cities. It means severe water crises in places like Bangalore and Chennai where bore wells are just hitting hard rock. It means losing our natural lakes to real estate because of unregulated urban infrastructure. And ultimately, it means relying on private companies for basic human needs like water, which only widens the gap between the rich and the poor. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. We have these incredible, immense constitutional promises of dignity, equality, and individual liberty written down. But as we've seen from the budget, we are entirely constrained by the stark mathematical reality of limited state resources. So how do we balance the two? How do we ensure that the written rights on paper can actually survive the economic reality of the real world? It's really the ultimate challenge of our democracy. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this gave you a whole new perspective on how our Constitution truly functions in reality.